Moving into the next of Rossiter's hats that the president wears is chief legislator. Traditionally, the president's really only, or rather, at least according to the Constitution, the president was only involved at the very beginning and at the very end of the legislative process. And I say at the beginning sort of loosely. The Constitution calls for the president to deliver a State of the Union address to Congress. And so here the president goes into the House of Representatives, their actual chamber, and addresses both the House members and the Senate, who also come over. So this is the president coming into Congress's House and saying, "Hey, here's what's going on. Right? Here's the state. Here's what's happening of the Union of the United States." And here the president was has come to sort of introduce a lot of policies or things that he cares about or she cares about and wants to see happen. So it's become quite a political speech, but it was also a place for the president to sort of say, "Hey, here's what I think needs to happen. Hey, don't forget we need to build a bunch of rivers or need some new interstates," or whatever it is. So the president has that platform to sort of get the ball rolling in some areas that they think is necessary. At the very end of the process of the legislative process, right? Remember that Congress introduces the bill, kicks it out to the committees do their work. Very, very few bills ever leave committee, and then the both chambers vote on those bills, and if there's a conference committee that's needed, great. And once everything is in order, they send it over to the executive office, to the president. And the president has an option, has three options. They can sign a bill into law. So by signing this document, this is a check on congressional power. Right? We have the president, so the executive branch and the legislative branch have to agree on a law. So a bunch of different places must agree, different people must agree that this is in fact a good law. So again, we see a part of that, the checks and balances. Another check that the president has at this point in time is the ability to veto a law. So to veto a law, the president just simply doesn't sign it. So they don't. Sometimes the president can issue what's known as a veto statement, saying, "Here's why I disagree with it." But if the president simply doesn't sign a bill, well, it doesn't become law. So here we have another check. So if the executive branch feels that Congress is overreaching or doing something unconstitutional, and today it's even something they don't like, the president can veto it. So it does not become law. One special type of veto is a pocket veto, and this is used only after Congress leaves session. Excuse me. So rather than having to explicitly say, "I, President, whoever, veto this bill," right, and not signing it, the president can just ignore something. But the pocket veto only takes place after Congress is done for the session. So they've all gone home, they've packed up their bags for that particular meeting of Congress, and there's nobody there to override the veto, right? So the president just kind of think of them sticking the bill in their pocket and just forgetting about it, saying, nope, not going to happen." So again, that was traditionally, right? So that was at the very start and the very end. More recent presidents, so the modern presidents, have taken up a much bigger role in the whole legislative process, and we'll get to some reasons behind why that is the case and why Congress is okay with that in just a moment. But presidents today will oftentimes write entire bills. They'll write up a bill, submit it to Congress, say, "Hey guys, what do you think about this?" And the House and the Senate will kind of kick it out to the committees, and they'll do the whole rigmarole. Um, Presidents are also used to find support for legislation or topics or things like that. So if the president feels strongly about immigration or a trade policy or whatever it is, the president can give a bunch of speeches and can make sure that people are very aware of this particular problem. So finding support and also working to find support. The president can also exert a lot of influence when it comes to actually getting votes necessary to pass a bill. And there's a number of ways that presidents can do that, largely through promises of funding or something like that. So we see relative to these two things, right? Only at the start and at the end versus involved throughout the entire process, right? We see Congress is losing a lot of authority here. The president is sort of stepping in and kind of taking these things over. So I want you to take a moment and consider why Congress might be okay with that. Two of the major reasons are number one, Congress wants to avoid a veto. Congress doesn't want to spend hours and hours and hours and who knows how many dollars and time and efforts and energy putting together a bill that the president is just going to veto at the end of the day, right? So by getting the president on board early, Congress can have an idea of what the president is thinking, what it would take for the president to sign off on this bill, and so there's more guarantee that the president won't veto it. Also, with the president being a unitary individual, right, is just a lot easier for the president to get something done. If ever you have been with 3 or 4 or 5 friends trying to decide on a movie, it can be a little tough, right? If you all agree, hey, let's go see a movie tonight, but then one of y'all wants the romantic comedy, the other one wants the horror, the other one wants the action, the other one wants the artsy film, right? It's tough, right? And that's Congress. Right? We've got people from all over the country with all different perspectives, all different concerns, all talking to each other. The president, though, is just one person. And the president has the entire executive agency, the entire executive branch of government at more or less at their disposal. So they have a lot of information. They have a single person in charge and a single person kind of guiding the whole process. So it's just simply easier in some ways for the president to do Congress's job, even though, again, it's still Congress's job, even if the president is doing it. But, Congress can always say, hey, we're the ones that have to actually pass this law. We're the ones that have to fund that law, right? So at the end of the day, Congress still is quote unquote in charge of creating legislation. But one place where the president can entirely go around Congress is through executive orders. I mentioned these briefly earlier. Executive orders are the executive, so the president, telling somebody to do something. Executive orders are a tool. They are part of the president's prerogative powers, just to kind of be in control of the executive branch, be in control of enforcing laws. That being said, executive orders can range from very, very minute, boring, not important things to hugely important things. The Emancipation Proclamation, the document that, at least on paper, freed slaves and ended slavery in the United States, was an executive order issued by President Lincoln. During World War II, President Truman seized all the steel mills in the country. Right, there was rumors that the factory workers were going to go on strike for better conditions, better pay, things like that, and steel was extremely important to our war effort. And so Truman said, yeah, that's not going to happen. The federal government is now in charge of every one of those steel mills. And we'll give them back. And they did. But for now, you guys can't strike. If you strike, you will be breaking a federal law and you will go to federal prison for doing that. Right. So sort of taking over a massive section of the economy, all in the name of kind of fighting World War II, right? So you can use these for pretty massively important things. Here we see the number of executive orders that have been issued as of today. So this is being recorded early July. So President Trump's term is not fully complete yet, but we see that he has issued 165 executive orders, which is more than President Obama had, actually more than most presidents that we see on this list in any one of their given terms. There's a lot of reasons on why executive orders might be used, but we're unfortunately not going to be able to get into them. Your book gets into some of those details. So we're going to move on to the next hat, and that is the chief of party. The president is the most visible member of their party. So President Trump is the most visible member of the Republican Party, and before him, President Obama was again the most visible member of the Democratic Party. So this is a hat where the president can really articulate policies and ideas and things that an entire party could ostensibly kind of get behind. And as the head of a given party, the president can also go to something like a fundraising event or speak on your behalf if you happen to be up for re-election, right? So the president shows up and all of a sudden, hey, that's an exciting name. I want to buy a $10,000 ticket to go have dinner with the president, right? Something like that, and that money then goes to your reelection campaign, right? So it's sort of a bonus for people in that regard. Finally, we have the president as the chief diplomat. Foreign policy powers, as we'll get into in one of the later lessons this semester, foreign policy is one of the big areas of presidential power. The idea is that the president is the face of the nation, the face of all of the United States. So rather than having France, who wants to have a treaty with the United States, so rather than making France deal with Indiana and Michigan and Montana and Texas all separately, well, we just have one person that they go to, one point place. Um, the president is the one who sends ambassadors. So those folks who represent the United States to other countries, right? So ambassadors to England and Australia and Russia, well, they're all acting and speaking on behalf of the president who speaks on behalf of the United States. And same thing when other nations send their ambassadors to us. The president can also recognize another nation. So in recognizing a nation, that means that we as a country are allowed to do business with them. So for a long time, Cuba, for example, was not recognized as a country. President Obama started the process of allowing businesses to send money and tourists going into Cuba itself, and a lot of that's been reversed since. But it allows us to say, hey, Cuba, your country, or for example, North Korea is not a recognized country, so we are not allowed to do business with them. Finally, in the area of foreign policy, the president is allowed to enter into executive agreements. Executive agreements are kind of similar to executive orders, right? Executive orders deal with United States stuff, whereas executive agreements deal with foreign nation things. So, for example, NAFTA, actually not NAFTA, but the USMCA, the U.S. Canada Mexico agreement, is this agreement between these three countries that greatly reduces, if not eliminates, tariffs on things moving between our goods, between our different countries. Now, this is not the same thing as a treaty. A treaty is something that the president can arrange with another nation, but then the Senate has to confirm it before it becomes law. An executive agreement is just something some president agrees to. So it's very easy to overturn them, as we saw in the case of NAFTA. Right? NAFTA was something that was agreed to by a previous president as an executive agreement. So President Trump came in and had the authority to just toss that one out, start something new. So that kind of wraps us up on the 6 hats of the president. And so we saw a lot of the major areas of concern that presidents have. But that being said, right, the president is not the one who's actually doing a lot of these things. The president cannot do all of these things, right? The president is just a single person. So within the executive branch, there is a lot of what's known as institutional support. And we'll look at each of these here in just a moment. But 3 major areas include the cabinet, the executive office of the president, and then the White House staff. And again, we'll look at each of these 3 on subsequent slides. So first off is the cabinet. And the cabinet consists of kind of advisors to the president, right? They help the president carry out the function of executing laws all across the government. And the cabinet consists of 15 different departments plus the vice president. So it's 16 people plus any others that the president wants to glom on. So usually there's a trade representative. Sometimes there's somebody from the intelligence agencies. And each of the departments, at least, the member of the cabinet is the secretary of that department, and the secretary is the person who is in charge of that entire department. So here, for example, we see President Trump holding a cabinet meeting where all these folks around the table are either the vice presidents or members of one of the major departments in the executive office, or one of those other kind of add-on folks that the president can bring into these meetings at their pleasure. So each of the members that we saw here, right, or at least 15 of them, are the heads of each of these departments. And departments are the major groups or organizations that help to really carry out the laws of the government. And we've got some massive agencies in here. So something like Department of Homeland Security, Department of Agriculture, Department of Veterans Affairs. So anything dealing with veterans or agriculture, right? That's being administered by these different departments. And we'll get a lot more, we'll get into more detail on these groups in our lesson on the bureaucracy. So I'll kind of save some comments for there. Moving into the second of the institutional supports that we saw a couple slides back is the Executive Office of the President. In 1937, right, again, this is Franklin Roosevelt time, excuse me, Roosevelt was realizing that he was struggling to accomplish all of the things that he had sort of set himself out to do under the current arrangement of the executive office. And so he formed a group known as the Brownlow Commission. And the Brownlow Commission was asked to look into ways that the president could better execute or carry out their job. And the first lines, these are the first words that we see there in quotes of the report that the Brownlow Commission issued, is that the president needs help. Which makes sense, especially given what Roosevelt himself was trying to accomplish through the New Deal and then very, very soon after this commission with World War II. So the Executive Office of the President today consists of about 4,000 folks who help the president in any variety of ways, and I've got a few examples here at the bottom of the screen. Most of the people here are quote unquote permanent employees, right? So that means that they are not hired and fired by the president. So these are merit-based positions, and they're not tied to whether or not the president likes you. So these are full-time, quote unquote permanent government employees. Some of the offices that are housed under the Executive Office of the President are something like the Office of Management and Budget, National Security Council, U.S. Trade Representative. These are offices that are tasked with providing information. So whether or not this one country is a threat to us, whether or not job numbers are growing or shrinking, whether or not the steel industry is contracting, or if we're about to get into a tariff war with China, right? Those facts, those details should not be political, right? We don't want to have somebody's take on whether or not the thing the president from that other country said about us is a declaration, right? We don't want somebody's interpretation. We want, here's what the president said. Here's what that person said. Here are what the job numbers are doing. And so we, excuse me, the Executive Office of the President is tasked with providing this information in a non-biased, and that's why it is a non-partisan manner. Also under the Executive Office of the President is the White House staff. Pardon me. Now the White House staff is smaller, right? These are 600 people or so, and these are individuals who do serve at the pleasure of the president. So these are the people closest to the president. They are tasked with things like speech writing and policy making, and helping to form an idea that will eventually turn into a law to help combat homelessness in America, right? Whatever the thing is. These are people that are tasked with taking the president's ideas and kind of putting them into action, putting them into words. So again, these are individuals who are very close to the president. The head of the White House staff is the chief of staff. Early forms of this particular office were called something like secretary to the president or assistant to the president, right? So it's somebody who's very, very close to the president in terms of like institutional organization. A lot of times they are gatekeepers to the president, so deciding who gets to talk to the president, who the president will call, whose ideas will get taken up as well. So kind of backing up, and currently Mark Meadows is President Trump's chief of staff. Kind of going back a little bit to this, and thinking back as well to numerous points where I've noted where the presidency has grown, where the executive branch has grown, where they've taken powers that used to be Congresses and now they're the executives, and all the different agencies that are involved in the executive branch itself. and it's just astronomically larger relative to what the founders created. Um, Washington, our first president, his executive department or his executive branch had four departments: Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and then the Attorney General. The largest department, and this was something that was managed by the Secretary of the Treasury, but the largest department was the post office. That was the biggest agency that the executive branch dealt with. So if you want to look at how much more powerful the executive branch has gotten, well, part of that has to do with how things have developed over time, right? The federal government today is much larger than it was. It's much more involved in the day-to-day runnings of the economy and society and this, that, and the other. And again, not going to take a stance on whether or not that's appropriate. Leave that aside, right? I'm just looking at facts on the ground. It is a much larger area. So we have this sort of organizational chart back under Washington and for the first several presidents after him. Compare that to our current organizational chart of the president of the executive branch. So we see the line at the top of the page here, right? So that's just going up to the Constitution, but I trimmed that out just to kind of make everything else just a little bit bigger. So Constitution's in charge of the executive branch, sure. Then below that, right, we've got the president, vice president, all tasked with everything else below. So we have a huge number of departments and agencies and government corporations and this, that, and the other, all of which the president is in charge of to some degree. And so just looking at the sheer number of things, right? We got the this versus the this. Looking at the difference, we see a huge expansion of the role of the president, of the federal government, of the executive branch. Now, a lot of these things simply just didn't exist at the time of the founding. So something like Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, right? Didn't have that technology back then, so it wasn't even a thing. Department of Homeland Security, again, not a thing. We weren't worried about terrorism. We called those people Brits at the time. So a lot of these just didn't exist. They weren't a thing that needed to be concerned with. But those that did exist, so things like education, things like commerce, things like the any trade issues that might come up between the states, well, those were handled by the states. So again, this is not exactly an apples to apples comparison, but a lot of the things that we see here now being controlled by the federal government used to be held by the states. Again, if they even existed. So this just really goes to show how much larger the federal government has become, how much more powerful the federal government has come to be. And the biggest beneficiary of the expansion of the federal government has been the presidency. Going back most clearly, most directly with Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal, we see the president taking on a much clearer role in really leading, not only leading the nation, and not just simply being the face of the nation or the first citizen of the nation, but being an active creator of policies, an active implementer of policies across a huge swath of life today in America. But again, the president is not the only one who's doing this, right? He's got a huge institutional support below him to help the president kind of carry out these things. So the president, whoever he or she is, right, relies on the bureaucracy in a major way to help undertake and implement all of the powers that the president now finds himself with. So our next lesson is going to get into more on the bureaucracy itself. So be sure to have those readings prepped. And with that, have a good rest of your day.